почати рух.
Нужна сила, которая объединяет миллионы.
Меняет ход історії.
Розвиває вміння відчувати.
Думати, чути.
Сила.
Без которой невозможно.
Твоя свобода.
Громадская культура.
Громадська культура.
Громадська культура.
Громадська культура.
Good evening from our headquarters in Kiev. This is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time show explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. And I'm Natalia Humenyuk, and tonight I'm very happy to have in this studio our colleague Christian Boris, a Canadian journalist who is just coming from the Ukrainian Eastern front line.
And that will be our first topic of discussion today, actually. And on that topic, on the crisis in Avdiivka, today we'll be speaking with the head of the political department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ukraine. We'll also have Alexander Hug, the chief monitor of the OSCE's mission in Ukraine. We'll also be speaking with Lucien Kim, who's an NPR correspondent in Moscow, and Matt Kufer from the Moscow Times to find out more about the Kremlin's view on Ukraine in light of the recent escalation. And finally, we'll have a live interview from Bucharest with Adelin Petrasor, who is the chief international correspondent at TVR, and we'll find out why 250,000 people have come out to protest in Romania.
So I'll remind you that you can download our podcast on Mixcloud if you would like to have just audio only version of our show and full interviews, as well the full version of all the talks we have here and all the reports you can find at our webpage en.hromadske.ua.
And we'll be back in a second. So the last week in Ukraine saw the biggest escalation of fighting since the Battle of Debaltseve. It's arguable if it's been 2014 or 2015 since we saw this level of escalation, but nonetheless, it's certainly been the heaviest level of fighting since the signing of Minsk II.
So we know in official figures that on Ukrainian side there would be 19 people who were killed, 79 injured. There were 40 military. And I'd like also to bring the map of eastern Ukraine just to show that probably the people who follow the situation, they look at Avdiivka. This is a town which is very, very close to Donetsk, and they were fighting there, random fighting and sporadic fighting during the last half a year. But now we see the escalation on other towns and villages near Mariupol, near Luhansk. So we are following on the topic and trying to make sense what it all means, how serious is the crisis and to what it lead. And Christian, just before we go and have a discussion, you've just coming back from Avdiivka, that name become known this week. So really, what would be like the major thing people should understand about, like, and the foreign audiences especially?
The major thing that people should understand is that this was a town of 20,000 people that were left without electricity, without water, without heat, without any sort of power in minus 20-degree temperatures. We were wearing, the correspondents who were there, the volunteers, the NGOs, everybody who was there was wearing 2 pairs of gloves, 2 pairs of socks, and people were still freezing, and people were going home back to their apartments at night and living through just relentless shelling. And the thing that was the most terrifying and the most unique about Avdiivka is the amount of Grad missiles that were used. You could just see the craters all over the town, and it truly was just a week of hell for the people who were living there.
But how did you talk to people? Were they, I don't know, disappointed, frightened, outraged? Just like, I don't know, what was the mood in the town?
Disappointed is the best way to put it. Disappointed is the best way to put it because this war started 3 years ago, and people have been through this level of violence before. And they thought that that level of violence had already gone away, that time had passed. They were hopeful that it would never come back. And so as one woman who was standing in line waiting for humanitarian aid put it, she said to us, "Stop taking photos of me. I don't want to see people. I don't want people to see me begging again."
I'll also remind that besides following Hromadske, the audience can read your reports and at the Washington Post and Canadian broadcasting company at CBS webpage, but you also have way more stories, also from our own correspondents who are still working on the ground. And before we go to the political discussion, we really would like you to have the feeling of how it's there. It's our very recent report from our correspondent who also really even talked to the people who had the people being shot right near them.
Люди все очень испуганы, состояние ужасное. Были на первом этаже, зашли в квартиру, женщину трусит. Нужна медицинская помощь, потому что состояние просто кошмар.
У всех тут разные мнения. У меня, я считаю, что нас в ДНР обстреливали, а он брат. Мы с ним даже на эту тему не разговариваем, чтобы не поругаться. А потом уже началось, я не знаю сколько раз, я уже даже не считала.
Constant fighting in this area led to critical infrastructure being severely affected. Last part of this week, since Sunday morning, we still have temperatures dropping below 10 degrees in the night. This is not normal, and it's only due to the fact that these guns are here that should have long been withdrawn.
Улица Молодежная, 13. Это еще один дом, пострадавший вчера вечером от прямого попадания снаряда.
Да.
21:26 я успела посмотреть на часы. Услышала первый перелет возле дома. С мужем упали на пол и лежали. Ждали, пока все это закончится.
Нет, так а куда мне идти? Ну вот стоят люди.
Готовиться, что скажешь. Стараемся, помогаем как можем, вы ж видите.
Ночі до самого ранку продовжувалися обстріли, дуже гучні були обстріли. Туди розвозяться зараз продуктові набори, ті, що поступають до гуманітарної допомоги, від Карітаса поступають і від інших. Це яка може бути евакуація, і це таке слово, в зв'язку з чим нас тут нема. Електроенергія буде, дивіться, вода є, теплопостачання, тут знаходиться заступник міністра інфраструктури, він вивчає ситуацію відповідно норм, нагнали тепло. Газ в квартирах він не був, тільки не було світла.
Тобто потреби немає?
Яка потреба?
Хорош. Спасибо. На здоровье.
Это оперативно-спасательный автомобиль Главного управления ГСЧС Украины в Донецкой области. Он был вчера направлен в общеобразовательную школу номер 2, где спасатели начинали разгружать гуманитарную помощь для населения города Авдеевки. В 21:10 в результате артиллерийского обстрела пострадал автомобиль, и вследствие обстрела погиб водитель. И начальник Авдеевского гарнизона ГСЧС Украины в Донецкой области получил ранение в брюшную полость.
Авдеевская школа номер 2. Здесь организован еще один пункт выдачи гуманитарной помощи. Сегодня здесь разгрузилось 4 20-тонника с товарами первой необходимости. Сегодня здесь многолюдно, а вчера вечером снаряд, упавший в эту воронку, образовавший эту воронку, убил водителя и тяжело ранил начальника Авдеевского гарнизона МЧС.
Сейчас пацаны уже подъезжают, уже по Молодежной ехали. Зачем мы?
А это что такое?
Гуманитарка на вас на наш дают. Никто не бросит в беде, никто. И даже речи об этом не может быть. И дети наши здесь, и все здесь. Взяли и памперсы получили для детей, 8 месяцев ребенку. Все тут. А куда ехать?
And as Ukrainian journalists, we're following closely the situation also in the separatist control area, as there are the Ukrainian citizens living there. So with the help of our colleague from Reuters, we can also give you a bit of the feeling how it affects the life of the people in separatist control area, in particularly near Donetsk. So there is a short story from there.
Был прилет такой, что я даже не понял. Я отлетел, я буквально стоял как с вами. Вот в полуметра или в метре от вас. Грубо говоря, в метре от вас.
Вы чудом остались живы, да?
Не знаю, может, мама в рубашке родила. Чудом остался жив.
Посечено дом, окна, стекла повыбивали в доме у нас. На лестничных клетках повыбиты стекла. Машина тут стояла легковая у нас, прошила осколками всю. Мальчик хорошо двигатель не задет. Отвез ее, уехал с ней. Вот в той квартире все стекла выбиты тоже.
And to help us to understand where Ukraine is on that and what we are going to do next, we have the head of the political department of the Ukrainian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Alexei Makeyev. Good evening.
Good evening.
Alexei, I think the question that everybody is asking after this week of escalations is, what led to this? What is the government's position on how this came about? Because there was not relative calm, but there was enough calm that was that was established over the past 2 years, and then this sort of comes out of nowhere.
What we have witnessed last week in Avdiivka and in Mariupol, practically along the whole touchline, is one of the worst humanitarian crises we've seen since the start of Russian aggression. You know, I start every morning with reading reports from the front line, and this is for the first time I see their names of civilian casualties. So since January 29th, we have 18 military killed in action, 100 wounded. But this time we have 3 civilians killed, 9 civilians wounded, more than 200 buildings damaged, or some of them destroyed, and I'm sure you have seen all that. We have evacuated 249 people and many children, and of course more than 20,000 people are now left without heating, electricity, and what we've heard just recently that our people managed to get the electricity working for the city of Avdiivka. Well, 1,000 people affected, hundreds of people forced to move from there. One of the worst humanitarian crises that is made by Russian Federation, by their occupational forces and by their proxies in Donbass.
But really, what would be your explanation that everybody would ask? Why it had started now? So what would be the government position, and what the Ukrainian strategy now is, you know, to keep defense, to advance, to, I don't know, withdraw weapon?
I think the Russians now try to escalate the situation and to look what direction of the new American administration would be, and how the European Union and NATO countries would react on that. We've been using all diplomatic means. We have on the very first day, we instructed our ambassadors all over the world to explain the situation in the capitals. We've called the 2 meetings of the OSCE, the Council of Europe, Ministerial Committee of Ministers, just were informed by our permanent representative about the dire situation and dire human rights situation in the occupied Donbass and, of course, in Avdiivka. And, of course, we had two meetings of the United Nations Security Council. In the first meeting under our presidency was fully devoted to Ukraine.
Then to that topic, I'll ready to represent the quote from this meeting. I'm speaking about a particular quote of our representative of the permanent representative in the UN, Yelchenko. So that's what I would like. We listen and then we go on to understand, how effective you see that.
Okay.
There has to be no illusion about the Russian role in the Minsk agreement's implementation. Every bit of a progress reached in the TCG or on the contact line is flagrantly destroyed by another assault by Russia-led terrorists. Second, the existing mechanisms created to avoid further destabilization and to move forward with implementation of Minsk agreements are not as efficient as is necessary to fulfill their mandate. Despite the urgency of the situation, the TCG met only 3 days after the outbreak of hostilities. The JCCC appeared to be an ineffective tool in the crisis situation. All this due to the Russian non-cooperation.
But Alex, you really, of course, in the UN, everybody blames everybody. Ukraine presented facts. There was a support of the US as well. But really, how that would be effective? And, it's still not clear what exactly Ukraine wants at this point.
Well, we want...
besides, of course, we want to end the war with Russia. Of course, we would like to have their, Ukrainian territory back, but...
Well, I have to say it every time talking to our international partners. What we want is to have Russia out of Ukraine, and this is absolutely what our international partner understands. And this is a good question. Look, every single representative in the United Nations Security Council supported Ukraine, but none of them supported Russia. And what we've faced this time, Russia is completely isolated in the United Nations Security Council. Look, the new permanent representative of the United States, Nikki Haley, was absolutely backing Ukrainian position. The UK was unequivocally supporting Ukraine and blaming it all on Russia. Sweden, Japan, Italy. So Russia is now looking... Well, Russia before that was hoping that with the new administration there'll be no blaming. That Russia and the United States will find a way how to push the whole Ukrainian conflict under the carpet. But they didn't manage to do that. And what we see in the OSCE in Vienna last week, what we saw during the 2 Security Council meeting, Russia is isolated. And this is absolutely good signal that sanctions will be kept until Russia gets out of Donbass and keep up to their promises and commitments under Minsk agreement. And the Crimea sanctions will remain until Russia gets out of Crimea. And this was clear position of Nikki Haley last week.
And President Trump and President Poroshenko had their first phone call. We saw the readout of the phone call, and I'm curious, this war has been going on for such a long time. The U.S. has pledged its support already. Trump seems to be pledging his support through that statement. What do you anticipate this first year looking like between the 2 administrations, and how do you finally end this conflict? Is there a chance to end this conflict with Trump as president?
From the very outset of the Russian aggression, we always told to the Russian side, to our international partners, that we don't want a military solution, we want a political solution of this conflict. And of course, what now our administration is now trying to do to continue the support of the free world against Russian aggression and against Kremlin. And those important signals, when they are sent now from Washington, when they are sent from Berlin, this is an absolutely clear message to Putin. There will be no deals at the coast of Ukraine. I think this is one of the most important messages stemming from this week's discussions in the United Nations Security Council.
There is also another quote from the deputy head of the Ukraine's present administration, Mr. Yeliseyev. I want to bring it to ask the question.
We manage the counter-offensive, so Russian militants are the ones who should kick themselves. We need to get back to the contact line we had in 2014, and we need Debaltseve returning to Ukraine. We are also interested in the US top authorities to be informed about our position in Minsk. We are working on.
So, Alexei, that was a bit confusing. Of course, Debaltseve, for instance, would sound confusing to some of our audience, which is not closely following, but still, that town Ukraine had lost 2 years ago. And, it sounds like what exactly Ukraine wants at this point on the Minsk, according to Minsk agreement, because that would be always the talk that Ukraine also isn't really proceeding with the elections, with the constitution amendments. So you can't really just say that okay, Russians are keeping their puppets, their separatist fighting, but so then we won't do anything and wait till they are calmed down. So what would be the Ukrainian really actions to move the situation somewhere?
Well, once again, the case of Debaltseve is not forgotten. In Minsk agreements, in the September 2014 agreements, the line is defined. And after September 14, Russians have got more than 1,000, I think, 300 square kilometers of our territory. So if we say about implementing Minsk agreement, point number one is, of course, ceasefire. So we're still waiting for a clear order from Kremlin to their troops and their proxies to cease the fire, to withdraw their weapons and to stick to the line of September 19, 2014. This is the Minsk line where Debaltseve is under control of Ukrainian government. A big part of the territory, which is now in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast controlled by Russians and their proxies, shall be given back to Ukraine. And of course, after having solved all the security-related issues, we can go with the political stuff. We can go with the economic and, of course, hostages. This is absolutely impossible that so many Ukrainians are kept hostage on the occupied territories, because this is about people. And of course, what is happening now in Avdiivka, this is all about people. This is not about lines, this is not about constitution, this is about the life of the people. And what we see in Russian Federation, they don't care about it.
But getting Debaltseve back would be about lines, right?
Well, this is one of the questions you asked me. What about Debaltseve? Debaltseve should belong to government-controlled territory. So the case of Debaltseve cannot be forgotten. Oh, Debaltseve is happened 2 years ago. Just forget about it. Let's work on constitution. But this is exactly Russian line. Forget about people. Forget about ceasing the fire. Let's have a constitution. Let's have more rights to the people, and then maybe we'll stop the fire. This is absolutely perplexed logic of Russians, and is ground for sending their propaganda, as if Ukrainians don't want to stop the conflict. To stop the conflict, one should stop the fire.
It's exactly the time we can show, of course, I think there is little trust, and I'm very open with that, to what sometimes the Kremlin says. But there is a quote we would like to bring, which is said by Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, who is heard in some of the capitals. So that's how he put that. we would like to have.
Ukrainian leadership today needs money, and the best way to squeeze out money from the European Union and certain countries of the European Union and the United States, as well as international financial institutions, is to present themselves as a victim of aggression. That's first. Second, as we know from the election campaign in the USA, the current Ukrainian leadership took a one-sided position by supporting only one candidate.
Позицию в поддержку одного из кандидатов.
That's not the random quote besides everything, because there are a lot of talks about that in, even foreign media, that, Ukraine is interested in this escalation. That's in a way that finally put a bit of the pressure to the Western governments, especially when Ukraine is, presiding in the Security Council. What do you say on that?
Well, Russians get used to a tactics of creating alternative facts, which are not facts at all. So the truth is that Russians started this aggression. The truth is that Russians killed more than 2,300 our soldiers and more than 10,000 people in Ukraine. The truth is that Russia is bringing its armed forces, its weaponry, and finance terrorists on our territory. So this is the truth. And the truth how the whole world understands is something which in Russian Federation will not be respected at all. So create an alternative fact, blame it all with the Russian television, Russian propaganda as the only way how Russians try to persuade people in the West and civilized world. But we are talking to them. We are talking to the new administration, U.S. administration. We're still in a close, very productive contact with Germans and the French, and trying to urge Russia to do what they are committed to do in Minsk.
Thank you very much, Alexei. We really appreciate the time.
We would like to ask one question after we have in a line from Donetsk, Alexander Huk, who is the chief monitoring mission of the special monitoring mission of the OSCE. So, Alexander, thanks a lot for being with us at this moment. We have the very, we're trying to summarize this very difficult week. We show numerous reports. We quoted of some of your reports, but generally explaining, so what happened this week? What would be an assessment, and how by the end of Sunday, you would explain, is situation calming down, or it's still that, escalated?
Good evening. Indeed, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has registered early morning hours a week ago on Sunday an uptick in violence in the wider area of Avdiivka, the Donetsk airport, and Yasinovata. We have seen these violations increasing up to the 31st of January. There, throughout the day, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has registered over 11,000 ceasefire violations on a single day, the highest number ever recorded since the mission has hit the ground in Ukraine. Then, towards the end of the week, until this day, the ceasefire violations had been reduced, and we have seen now calmer nights, less explosions, and in translation that means less use of heavy weapons that are prescribed by Minsk at the contact line. However, the numbers are still far too high. In the past 24 hours in the Donetsk region alone, we have been registering over 1,300 ceasefire violations. They are concentrated at 3 main hotspots, that is to the south, to the north and northeast of Mariupol, in the center around Donetsk airport, Avdiivka and Yasinovata, and to the east there between Svetlodarsk and Debaltsevo. There in these geographic areas, most and the majority of all violations that the mission has been recording had been occurred.
Alexander, we spoke 2 days ago in Avdiivka, and I asked you about the intensity of the conflict and whether you expected it to increase. And at that time, we could hear shelling in the background, and it seemed like it was spiraling out of control. And now, 2 days later, it seems like it's totally calmed down. To people who don't follow the conflict closely, how do you explain that type of ability to turn it on and off like that?
You're absolutely right. The situation remains highly unpredictable, and it's unpredictable because the root causes of this uptick in violence are still present at the contact line in these three hotspots, and that namely is the presence of heavy weapons on both sides of the contact line. We have seen in our reports, we have seen them within the city of Avdiivka, we have seen them within the city of Donetsk and elsewhere along the contact line. Just today, our patrols, for instance, in Hromadske, across of Avdiivka, have seen T-64 tanks in an area where they shouldn't be. We have seen a massive amount of these weapons in an area they have had to be removed a long time ago. Furthermore, the close proximity of the Ukrainian armed forces and armed formation positions are far too close. This leads to constant tensions in these areas, and these tensions translate often in long-lasting battles. The numbers that we've been registering today are still far too high. It remains and will remain unpredictable unless these weapons are withdrawn and there is some more distance between the positions that are now far too close.
And Alexander, you mentioned that previously. You mentioned that the violations have become blatant. That whereas they used to try to hide the violations and the equipment, now it just seems like everybody's keeping everything out in the open, and they really don't care if OSCE observers see them. And we saw that in Avdiivka this week. When did this start happening? Is this new?
Well, first of all, it's very important to mention that the task of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is to monitor and observe, and it's those who have committed to bring about change and to take measures to react on these reports. And therefore, we expect, of course, that when the mission indicates violations of Minsk, that measures have been taken to remove those violations, to bring about more stability and normality to the line. But you're right. We have seen, especially in the past week, more weapons in the open, more weapons during daytime in the open. It is naturally then when you count 11,000 plus violations as in a single day, that there must be an equal amount of weaponry on both sides of the contact line, and an equal amount of man handling this weaponry, and an equal amount of supply systems that supply these guns at the contact line. And therefore, it is no wonder that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission sees more hardware when the ceasefire violations turn up.
Alexander, I'll have still one question on real situation in Donetsk, but before, we have here in the studio the representative of the Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alexei Makeyev, and really always the question, of course, we speak a lot about the violation from the separatists here, and that's what the Ukrainian government obviously expresses, confirming it with the facts. But my question would be, I'd like, Alexei, you join shortly to the conversation. You see that there are the talks, the reports by OSCE, which also say that Ukraine isn't withdrawing fully to the extent it is supposed to do. So what would be your answer on that? Because that is a criticism which also coming internationally to Ukraine as somebody who tries to be, a side which is respecting the international rules and the agreements.
Well, once again, hello, Alexander. Once again, what our position is that we always stick to our commitments about the ceasefire. And after recent escalation by the Russians, it is, of course, needed that the ceasefire will be established and we start withdrawing the troops. This is also in our interest. But what the difference between the Russian and their proxies tactics is that we never use our weapon against civilian districts. We avoid shelling from the civilian districts and populated areas towards populated areas. And once again, this is what this government wants, is to stop hostilities and to return to a peaceful life for all the citizens of the region.
We're extremely curious that you're in Donetsk. Of course, it's very difficult for some of the foreign correspondents and the Ukrainians to be there. So what you can say about situation currently? do you hear shooting? You know, how much damage is caused to the civilian population? As of course, there would be in such kind of conflicts talks that, you know, the sides are not targeting civilians.
During the brief discussion we have had now, I have heard from the room here 3 explosions within the city perimeter. We have seen, of course, for a long time that the western and northeastern outskirts of the city have been severely affected by the ongoing fighting now in its 3rd winter. And also midweek when Avdiivka was hit in the center, more or less at the same time Donetsk city was hit in the center. And sadly, the civilians in both cases have been suffering. There were 2 killed civilians in Avdiivka and 2 killed civilians here in Donetsk city. Both parts of the equation here suffer equally. But I can also give you some good news today. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has tried now, together with the Joint Center for Control and Coordination and the sites, to re-establish and reconnect electricity that would then provide the residents of Avdiivka and the water filtration station in Donetsk electricity. And now today, in mid-afternoon, that had been managed, and it is now done, and we have heard that the lights went back on in Avdiivka, and I think this is where everyone should be focusing on. The humanitarian agenda should come first. Any political agenda should have the second seat. It's equally important, however. The civilians in this conflict have been suffering for far too much on both sides of the line, and that is where the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission would like that more attention is being paid, and we shall make sure that the suffering of the population is being highlighted, and where we can, as we have done today, in cooperation with other stakeholders, we will try to make sure that some of the damage that had been the result of this ongoing fighting can be remedied, at least on a temporary basis. But once again, restoring electricity for Avdiivka is a temporary measure, and it might be quickly undone if the sides do not undertake measures that will calm down the situation more sustainably. At the moment, we have an unstable situation. This needs to be changed and can be changed if some of the major provisions of Minsk are being implemented with no compromise.
Okay, Alexander, thanks a lot for clarification and for this summary of the week. We'll follow your work as well, and we'll follow all what also, you know, what we know new. And before, we would like also to hear how the whole thing, the foreign reporters based in Moscow could explain, you know, how big that in the agenda. Not to speak just about the, you know, figures. We would like also to remind you about how it affects the people on the ground, and that would be also one of our, you know, some of the clip from our one of our best reports from the field this week.
А чого так пізно вночі? Додому йти не хочете? Вночі не страшно вам додому йти? Чи ви тут збираєтесь цілу ніч?
А мы до утра будем здесь сидеть. Тут тепло, хорошо, нас накормили, напоили. Чай, кашу давали, сосиску давали, яйцо вареное давали.
Да вы что?
Да, да. А чего мы пойдем домой?
На сьогоднішній день пункти обігріву відвідали понад 4 тисяч осіб. На даний час працюють 7 пунктів обігріву від Головного управління ДСНС України у Донецькій області, а всього працює 11 пунктів обігріву.
На сьогоднішній день вода дійсно була до 4-го поверху. Я хочу сказати, що вода відновлена і фактично зараз вона може і не доходить до 4-го поверху, але зранку вже буде йти питна вода, нормально, все вже організовано абсолютно.
Были раненые, были тяжело раненые. Всем помощь была оказана в полном объеме. Вот. Люди сюда поступали, мы их стабилизировали, оказывали необходимую помощь и отправляли дальше по этапам эвакуации, которые для нас разработало наше командование. Все было сделано разумно. Работали в связке военные, волонтеры, осаповцы, правый сектор. Сейчас тяжелым пациентам готовится эвакуация дальше. Вот. На каждом этапе им оказывается помощь, и эти люди эвакуируются дальше. Не пораненых мы не эвакуируем.
Просто ми чули, що приходять люди, просто які що бояться там бути і проходять
Приходят, да, кормим, поим, даем зарядить мобильный телефон без проблем. Но эвакуация только для больных и для раненых.
How does the Kremlin explain the situation that's sometimes worthy to follow? And we have Lucian Kim, the correspondent of NPR based in Moscow, explaining that's not just his opinion, but how he can see and analyze the situation back there.
Well, on the one hand, you have the media coverage, and what's interesting is that in state media here in Russia, Ukraine has again become a topic since the weekend, and there's been a lot of coverage of what Russian state media call a civil war in Ukraine, and of course the conflict that's continuing is very sensitive here because sanctions or the lifting of sanctions depends on the outcome or at least the beginning of some kind of resolution in Donbass. As far as the level of where it is on the agenda, actually I would say that from the point of view of the Kremlin, Ukraine is quite low. The Kremlin doesn't necessarily want Donbass to be on any kind of agenda, especially on a larger international agenda. They would prefer to focus on other matters.
On the topic of Donald Trump, he just had his phone call with Poroshenko. It was yesterday, I believe, or today. What did you make of the statement and the wording that came out of that phone call?
The statement that came out of the White House talked about finding some resolution on the Russian-Ukrainian border. So obviously some observers pointed out that the conflict isn't actually on the border between Ukraine and Russia, but actually further in the interior. And especially if you look on a map, Avdiivka is of course not very close to the Russian-Ukrainian border. Well, I noticed here, just looking at the way that Russian state media responded, almost the sort of the main point was that Russian state media noticed in the Ukrainian and in the White House readout of that phone call was that there was no mention of sanctions. Now, of course, the sanctions are an issue between Western countries and Russia and not directly involving Ukraine. So maybe that really wouldn't have been a topic anyway.
What is going on right now between Belarus and Russia? I mean, Lukashenko just had his 7-hour speech. What is the view from Moscow on what's going on there?
It's really quite interesting. Just to recap maybe briefly, I mean, the president of Belarus came out on Friday and made some very strong statements against Russia. He criticized Russia for sort of going back on its word as far as oil imports and blocking agricultural products from being imported into Russia from Belarus. It was quite an extraordinary performance. And of course, that comes in the wake of President Lukashenko, quite surprisingly, announcing that Russia or that Belarus would be loosening visa requirements for the citizens of 80 countries, which include the European Union and the US. Lukashenko's comments is that the Kremlin, within hours of this comment, the Kremlin released a statement on its website. And usually this doesn't happen. Usually the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, makes a comment to journalists, and this has been transmitted through the media. But in the case of Belarus, the Kremlin found it necessary within a few hours of President Lukashenko's comments to actually issue quite a long statement on the website, pointing out just exactly how much Belarus benefits from Russian subsidies. So again, this is the sort of the Belarusian factor is a surprise.
Joining us now live from Moscow is Moscow Times correspondent Matt Kufer. Matt, thanks for coming on the show. Hello, Matt.
Oh, hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Hey. So, Matt, we're very curious. You guys publish a great Sunday column on the roundup of the news that's coming out of Russia. And we're curious, what is the viewpoint on Ukraine right now after this most recent escalation?
Well, what I saw on Vesti today was a piece on allegedly on Ukraine trying to involve itself in the U.S. electoral campaign, and with Dmitry Kiselyov referring to this as something akin to Watergate. It was rather strange, and to me it didn't make a lot of sense, although we've heard a bit of this before. There was also some coverage of Putin's visit to Hungary to meet with Viktor Orban, and which mentioned the fact that there were protesters there wearing Ukrainian flags. It was not entirely clear who these protesters were. There was a suggestion that they were actual Ukrainians who had fled to Hungary and were somehow protesting from there. But it struck me, based on the short interview with one of them, that she didn't seem like a native speaker of Ukrainian or Russian, for that matter. So it was quite clear to me. Although I should say that on the whole, I think this topic, Ukraine for Russia, has really become a secondary one. It's not as big of a topic as it was before, yet at the same time, they still like to use it on the news, at least as a bit of a scarecrow. And they also tend to present a certain view on different reports in the West. For example, today they cited a Politico article on the fact that Yulia Tymoshenko reportedly had a conversation with U.S. President Donald Trump at the National Prayer Breakfast. But the news quoted only the rebuttal from the Poroshenko administration, which said that it was not really a meeting, and it presented that as reality because they apparently did not want to comment on the fact or show the fact that reportedly Trump told Tymoshenko that the U.S. would not remove sanctions from Russia unless progress was made on Ukraine.
And what about the phone call between President Poroshenko and President Trump? Did that receive much airplay in Russia?
From what I've seen so far, I didn't see much of it. I didn't see much. That said, from the readouts that I read of this phone call, it doesn't strike me as particularly telling. There isn't a lot there. It's a fairly standard readout from the presidential administration of Ukraine. It's a very short one from the White House with a rather bizarre phrasing that refers to working with Ukraine and Russia to restore peace on the border, something which perhaps is just a shorthand way of describing the situation that's not very tactful, not very accurate, or perhaps could suggest that the Trump administration doesn't entirely understand what's going on, which normally I would assume the former, but in the case of the Trump administration, I could possibly see the latter.
And we asked this question to Lucian as well, but it's always interesting to get somebody else's take on it. With regards to Ukraine's neighbor to the north, Belarus, there was some interesting things happening between the words that were coming out of Lukashenko's mouth this week regarding Putin. Can you explain what you saw on Russian media with regards to what Lukashenko said?
To be honest, I didn't see that much, although it's possible I missed it. That said, Lukashenko's words I wouldn't take as extremely meaningful. This is not to say that it's not an interesting moment in Russian-Belarusian relations, but this is not the first spat they've had, and it does stem from what appears to be some kind of a real concern regarding the border, that Belarus extended this visa-free regime for 5 days to citizens of 80 countries, and because there's no formal border with Russia, that raises some issues for Russia. That said, I think it's also an issue of the Belarus's jockeying to position itself between Russia and the West. This has become a more important issue recently, especially after the start of the Ukraine crisis. The Ukraine crisis has actually been, in some ways, beneficial for Lukashenko to a certain degree because he's been able to position himself as a negotiator. They lifted the U.S. sanctions on Belarus, in part because of the Minsk process. And Belarus has managed to make some statements that assert its independence from Russia. And there's no doubt that Belarus is concerned about this situation because after the start of the Ukraine crisis, after the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the conflict in the Donbass, I had contacts who worked with different organizations that had connections to Central Asia and post-Soviet states, and they said many of their contacts there were quite afraid and they couldn't get people to talk with them. I think we should not doubt the fact that Belarus is very concerned, and any situation in which it can assert its independence is now important.
Matt, for those of us who don't follow the Russian media all that close, is there anything that's being said that you think might be underreported in the West? I mean, everybody's making a big deal out of the way that the Russians are covering Trump, but is there anything else that's sort of lurking beneath the surface there that you think maybe deserves a little more attention or might surprise some people?
You know, I wouldn't say so. One of the issues with the Russian media is that it isn't necessarily reflective of the reality. So I've actually followed Russian coverage of Trump fairly closely, and I followed the reactions in Russian society. I was at both events held by a group of what I would call ultra-patriots, Russian ultra-patriots in support of Trump. The first, election-watching party, the second, an inauguration-watching party. And what I can say is that the media is very, very pro-Trump. These ultra-patriots were initially very pro-Trump, and their first election-watching party was very raucous. There was a lot of energy. People were drinking. It was quite fun in a certain way. Their second inauguration-watching party, they were very careful to stress this is not a party, it's not a celebration, it's a platform for discussion, what's going to happen. It's a platform just for discussing the possibility of improvement of U.S.-Russia relations. I would say, in terms of the Russian media coverage of Trump, we should really look beyond it, because they say very positive things about Trump in the Russian media. They defend him. I think that the decision makers, in contrast to the newsmakers, these are people who are saying to themselves, there's some possibility here. There's a possibility for improvement of relations, but it's very unsure. And I think they're guardedly optimistic, but they're not certain. And they have no reason to be certain. If I look at what's happened with Trump recently, some of the statements made by him or people from his administration regarding Ukraine, compared to the statements, his very pro-Russia statements, I would say that the advice for Ukraine would be, don't necessarily take Trump at his word when he says that they won't lift sanctions on Russia. And the advice for Russia would be, don't necessarily assume you can not take Trump at his word when he says that he won't lift sanctions unless there's progress on Ukraine. I don't think we know what's going to happen. Several weeks ago, they reported that he had very few cabinet posts filled, including all the deputy and deputy secretary or undersecretary, deputy secretary. Although I haven't seen recent numbers, I don't think they're filled. And if we look at Trump's first 2 weeks, it's been very chaotic. I would say that the U.S. policy on both Russia and Ukraine is going to be a work in progress, and I would not draw any conclusions. And I would not necessarily assume that what the Russian media says about Trump is a reflection of reality.
Matt, thank you very much, and always interesting to hear your insight from Moscow and give us a view from what's being said over there. And we're going to move on to Romania now, where the largest protests since 1989 have taken over the streets of Bucharest. And to better explain what's been going on,
so what we really should know about that story, besides that's a major protest, that was about the decree which could bring an amnesty for the state officials who had been, done some misconduct, but it's very closely connected to the president, to the current and new government. It's pity we would like to show you more videos, so that's what I also ask our team. We have a bunch of coverage from the streets of Bucharest that could be also seen. I think that picture would really give you the better feeling of it there, and that's how it looks live. There should be the title as well. That's what you see even happening now, despite of there some, it sounded that the government tried to set back. So we have there our colleagues from Romania, that is Sorin Ionita, who is currently there, and I think we have to, the people are there just right on the square. So that's what I would like to understand from our gallery, if the person who was just with us and who is currently on that square what you can see now can really explain in 2 minutes. I think that a bit too much to wait, but I really try to force them to be faster, because we're really looking for that phone, because it's still not very clear, Christian, but very interesting. So please keep the picture going. That the government tried to set back. Romania is one of still the most corrupt countries of the European Union. It is on the fourth place from the back. That was according to Transparency International. And there were a lot of people who'd been arrested during the last years. So what made the people angry there, that a lot of people had been arrested, but they could be freed. And as well, that the whole discussion on that was really done in a candid way, you know, that the people couldn't really, the civil society couldn't really follow. So there were some of the minor officials who tried to leave their positions, but that wasn't really, not, as we see from the crowd in Bucharest, it doesn't look that these people are satisfied. So,
well, I think it's interesting because some of the analysts that I've spoken to, as we see how many people have gathered, some of the analysts I've spoken to have told me that Romania, despite still being corrupt, has built the institutions that it needs in order to progress and build democracy and eradicate corruption, has built the institutions, and it was making significant progress. Obviously, these types of things take a long time, but some analysts have told me that Ukraine needs to sort of model itself after the progress that Romania has made. So to see this type of decree get such blowback in Romania from this amount of people, I think is quite an encouraging sign, because to bring this many people out into the streets is not an easy task.
Okay, so I think we'll try to reach the people in Bucharest in a few seconds, and you'll definitely have that coverage on our web page and on our platforms. But for that, we would say thank you for being with us, and please follow more. Please follow more. So thanks a lot, and goodbye.
Громадське презентує «Наша пісня гарна й нова». Укроборонпром продовжує купувати